So, Ethiopia is concluded because of a game ending bug, as is very common in these models. We got about 5 years in, and it indeed looks like it is feasible. You can, in fact, by spiking value added tax for about 10 years, pay off your debts and improve the conditions of the country in general. It will, however, result when you do the spike in a drop in GDP per capita and economic growth, but those are fairly short term period things. If the government spending is well adjusted, you can indeed do it, but only if one of the promises of doing it is lowering the value added tax incrementally later on. Otherwise, the businesses seem unlikely to support you. High taxes seem counterproductive to business. So it can be considered a form of governmental reform. It ought to be about a 10-year process. And some countries, especially those with low debt ratings, can in fact commit to it much quicker, which is why some are now seeing the benefits. Because low debt to GDP ratio allows you, in this case, to skip the paying back of debts phase of the high value added tax, where others might need to raise the value added tax as much as by 10%, they might go with the government spending and the paying back of the debts. You have to be at an excess to do that, and most countries are at somewhat of a deficit. And we have concluded that if you raise the value added tax and lower things like low income tax, and gas tax and stuff like that, the economy will be doing better. If you at the same time have a bonus of hybridization to your car, which, for example, the US has, you will be doing pretty well. Car hybridization is something I would look into with great interest. Because I would assume that carbon burning engines continue to remain on the planet, and that we continue to have a preference for having the ability to smell in urban areas. Not to mention the ability to breathe in urban areas, and that the human species will somewhat prefer urban areas. Perhaps not the inner cities, but somewhere reasonably urbanized. Therefore, we can predict that car hybridization, as in getting more mileage for your car with the same amount of fuel, would be preferable. Applying techniques that can produce that outcome. You need, for a base hybridization of your car, a battery capacity of about 3 or 4 times what you normally have, and a converter system that takes the energy your engine creates through the battery to the moving apparatus and attaches these things called brake energy converters, as in when you brake your car, it generates energy. That's car hybridization. It's that simple. Then, if you are looking for a reasonable solution to never having, if you drive like to your work and back and occasionally to the store of having to refuel, you get these things called thin foil solar panels and put like glue to the top of your car. One of those foils under the top. If it's a warm region and you occasionally drive, and you have the brake energy converter as well as a very efficient engine through the battery system as I described, you might be able to never have to put fuel in your car or put fuel like once a year or something. But it is very iffy. It depends on how efficient your thin foil solar panel technology is. Usually it's one third of what your solar panel technology is, usually, and that's regional. That's roughly what we're speaking. So if you're talking about having to put an X amount on top of your house to power your house, then you know how much your house needs. And from that, you can calculate how much energy your car produces when moving and how much battery capacity you need to keep it moving. And so on. It's very simple. It's very, very simple. Thank you, Brazil. And that will be what I believe is the next step because producing cars that have batteries seems to be a difficult thing for its only source and a plug to a wall. It seems to be difficult to do well compared to that type of car. But I would estimate that electric cars will become more prevalent at the same time. But there is a battery cost because battery chemicals are more scarce than fuel. They may be less polluting, but they're more scarce than fuel. So there's that. Which means we are doing our energy production by the largest amount on our planet first, which seems to be consistent with what ought to be done. So what we need to do now is to build a technology to somehow turn the carbon into fuel, and I believe that is through third generation biofuels, which is the technology of turning any kind of carbon dioxide into algae, which you then compress like any other thing, like freaking olive oil, and it produces oil because it's living matter. There's mostly oil inside it. What is inside the cell membrane in everything from bacteria to humans isn't technically liquid, it's oil. So if you produce a large amount of similar biomatter, you can turn it into oil. And if you take a large urban city and look outside, you'll see that there's a large amount of biomatter on the port side. It's usually greenish instead of blue, the water. Therefore, instead of farming cattle and trees, we can put funnel into side of city, start to extract the algae mass that is in the water, and release the pure fresh water back into the ocean. Instead of creating pollution, we can find a polluted area and generate fresh water back into the ocean. Now, if somebody happens to pay for the fresh water and it's actually taking both the fresh water and the biological contaminants in it, which usually end up in city farms or dumps, most commonly. Nobody likes oil with industrial pollutants as their like liquid supplement for the day. So it usually ends up in city dumps. If you can turn that into 95E petroleum at $6 a gallon, as you can currently, then you are pretty close to solving the problem. It was around 210 years ago, so we are very close. I believe by the time this simulation collapsed, which is 2026, we will have solved the problem. The gameplay bugs became so notoriously bad that you could not continue, so I will wait for roughly 6 months and then do a retry. I have to give them time to patch all the bugs. There is a newer version available of it, but I do not want to update and try again at this time. I do not consider it appropriate. The bugs were so plentiful, so it seems doable. I mean, literally. it turns the country very white. That's all I'm gonna say. No matter what country it turns very white. Very German. Joo. Jos olet ihan sikasairaan rohkea, niin me kokeile. UBIlle siirrät kaikki. Jos olet semmoinen, että etit semmoista oikein universaalia ydinoptioa, että kaikki kuitenkin pysyy kasassa, mutta kaikki mogaa. Ne on niitä ydinoptioita. Semmoisia Suomessa-aseita. Mutta ne on vain eri teholla ja ne on ihan niin kuin eri luokkaan mitoitettu. Tommonen, mikä osuisi jo, jos sä nyt teet sillai. Sorry, I'm just talking Finnish because I'm gonna talk Finnish. Jos sä nyt teet sillai, että sä laitat arvonlisäveron 10% ylöspäin. Samaan aikaan julistat UBIn käyttöä ja lasket muita sosiaaliturvia sillä, että UBIllä niin minimipalkalla niin tulee, tai siis minimisosiaaliturvalla niin tulee vähintään 500 € enemmän kuukaudessa ja sitten minimipalkalla puhutaan jostain 1 500 Suomessa. Ja sitten firmojen palkkakulut tippuu jollain 25-30%. Sen takia, koska firmat pystyy sitten maksamaan tämmöistä 1 000 € kuukausipalkkaa Suomessa ja jengi tulee silti ihan ammattilaisena kunnolla duuniin, niin kun tekee pitkää päivää ja sillä. Kuten UBI on voimassa. Jos sä oot semmonen, että sä haluat potkasta kaikkia muita valtioita niin kovaa kuin pystyt, niin teet sen, koska sit kaikki käy sun päälle kuin eläimet ja sä todennäköisesti silti voitat sen. Ne tulee niin lujaa päälle, että sä et ole elämässäsi nähnyt, kun ne tulee. Sä oot välittömästi kaikkien mielestä kaikkiin mahdollisiin sotarikoksiin syyllistynyt. Sä oot niinku kaikkien sen niinku se pahis. Sä oot fasisti silloin. Sä maksat kaikille siitä, että ne on. Me tunnettiin alussa siitä, että niillä oli tosi paljon suppikeittiä. Ne keitti köyhille safkaa ihan vitusti. Me tunnettiin siitä alussa. Pelaa Victoriaa, nyt kaikissa muissa niissä puolueissa tekee jotain kokouksia tai jotain tapahtumia ja sitten kun tulee fasistit, niin ne keittää vaan ruokaa ihmisille. Ei se silti tarkoita sitä, että silloin kun ne alkaa sotimaan, niin ne on oikeassa. Se on jo todistettu. Niin me ei voi sillä tilanteella mitään. So. I leave it to the populace to decide. I don't know which is better. But I do know that as a nuclear option, the value added tax reform isn't as good as the UBI reform. I will say that. You can do it with the value added tax, but the UBI still preferred. After all is said and done. Thank you for watching.